When a successful black woman is turned away from an elite hotel due to racial bias, she returns not as a guest, but as the new owner. As she rebuilds the hotel from the inside out, tensions rise and lives are changed, especially for the staff member who once dismissed her. But will the old guard of the hotel accept the new rules, or will Nina have to teach them a lesson they'll never forget? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Nina Anderson tugged her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of the sleek black car that had driven her to the front entrance of the Wellington Hotel. The night was cool, with a light drizzle casting a sheen on the marble steps. It wasn't the kind of weather anyone enjoyed being out in, especially after a grueling week of back-to-back meetings. But Nina wasn't just anyone. She was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world. And this trip was supposed to be a brief escape, a chance to recharge before her next big acquisition. As the doors to the Wellington slid open, a gust of warm air greeted her, and with it, the soft hum of wealth and luxury that the hotel was known for. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow over the pristine marble floors. Expensive fragrances filled the air, and the quiet murmur of guests enjoying drinks at the lobby bar added to the ambiance. It was everything Nina expected. Everything, except the look she received when she approached the front desk. Nina wasn't a stranger to opulence, nor was she a stranger to being the only black woman in the room in many of the elite circles she moved through. She had earned her place there, through hard work, strategic brilliance, and sheer determination. But no amount of success had ever fully insulated her from the subtle, or sometimes overt, ways people reminded her she didn't quite belong. The moment she stepped up to the desk, she noticed the change. The receptionist, a tall man in his mid-30s with a sharp suit and even sharper features, was mid-conversation with a colleague when he glanced at Nina. His expression shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening of the lips, the faintest narrowing of the eyes. His posture stiffened, like her presence was an inconvenience. "Good evening," Nina said, offering a polite smile as she slid her credit card across the counter. She had reserved the hotel's penthouse suite weeks in advance, a well-deserved treat after the whirlwind of negotiations she'd just wrapped up. "I have a reservation under Anderson." The receptionist didn't smile back. Instead, his eyes flickered over her, taking in the tailored black coat, the crisp white shirt, the understated but undeniably expensive jewelry. He picked up the card with the air of someone doing her a favor, rather than fulfilling a duty. His name tag read Christopher, and his whole demeanor screamed superiority as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Let me check," he said, but his tone was clipped, almost dismissive. He tapped a few keys, but his eyes didn't really scan the screen. Nina could feel the indifference radiating from him, and after several long seconds of silence, he handed her card back without even looking up. "I'm sorry, Miss Anderson, but it appears we don't have any rooms available for you," he said, his voice flat, as though this was a perfectly normal situation. Nina blinked, caught off guard by his response. "I'm sorry, that can't be right," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I booked the penthouse suite. It was confirmed." He gave her a tight, condescending smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, well, there must have been a mix-up with the system. We're fully booked tonight. Perhaps you could try one of the other hotels nearby." The suggestion was offered so casually, as though being turned away from a place she had a confirmed reservation was something she should just accept. As though it wasn't a big deal. As though she wasn't who she was. Nina inhaled deeply, trying to remain calm. She had seen this before. This kind of quiet, unspoken dismissal. The receptionist hadn't outright refused her because of her race, but the underlying message was there, clear as day. He didn't think she belonged. To him, she was just another black woman trying to get into a space he didn't believe was for her. She had half a mind to pull out her phone, show him the email confirmation, and demand to speak to the manager. But something in her gut told her it wouldn't make a difference. This wasn't about a clerical error or an overbooked hotel. It was about perception. She could argue with him all night, but the hostility in his eyes told her it wouldn't change a thing. Instead, She gave him a cold smile, one that mirrored the condescension he had offered her. "Thank you for your time, Christopher," she said, her voice icy. "I'll be sure to let your manager know how helpful you've been." He opened his mouth to respond, but Nina didn't give him the chance. She turned on her heel and walked out of the lobby, her head held high despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, the drizzle turning into a light rain, she didn't look back. She had dealt with this kind of discrimination before. People who judged her by the color of her skin rather than her accomplishments. But tonight it stung a little more. Maybe because she was tired, maybe because she had expected this night to be a brief escape from the constant pressure of her life. Whatever the reason, the rejection hurt more than she wanted to admit. Nina walked back to the car, her mind racing. She could go to another hotel. She could call her assistant and have them book her into the most luxurious suite available anywhere in the city. She could even make a scene on social media if she wanted to. But none of that would erase the quiet humiliation she had just experienced. As the car door closed behind her, sealing her away from the world outside, Nina leaned her head back against the seat and let out a long, slow breath. She wouldn't let this break her. She had built an empire on the back of these kinds of rejections, each one fueling her determination to prove them wrong. But this time, something was different. This time she wasn't just going to walk away. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen as she drafted an email. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Wellington Hotel had just made a very, very big mistake. And Nina Anderson wasn't one to let mistakes slide. Nina Anderson sat in the back seat of her car, the city lights flickering past the windows, but her mind was miles away. That quiet rejection from the Wellington Hotel had opened a floodgate of memories, each one uncomfortably familiar, pulling her back to a time when she wasn't the powerhouse CEO she was today. A time when people like Christopher, with their thinly veiled hostility, thought they had the right to decide her worth. Growing up, Nina's world had been full of barriers that most people didn't see. She was born in a small, tight-knit community where opportunities were scarce and expectations even lower. Her mother, a strong-willed woman who worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, had always instilled in her a sense of resilience. "You have to work twice as hard for half as much," her mother would say, her voice tinged with both pride and exhaustion. And Nina had learned that lesson early on. The world wasn't going to hand her anything, but that didn't mean she couldn't take it for herself. From a young age, Nina stood out. She had a sharp mind, one that constantly sought to understand how things worked, whether it was the inner mechanics of a broken radio or the complex social dynamics that played out in her schoolyard. She was quick to learn and even quicker to dream, imagining herself in a life far removed from the small, cramped apartment she shared with her mother. But her intelligence, ambition, and drive often put her at odds with the people around her. Her teachers, instead of encouraging her potential, often questioned her, asked if she was sure she wasn't cheating when she aced a test, or suggested she focus on more realistic goals. Classmates made snide comments, whispering that she thought she was better than them, while others simply ignored her altogether. And then there were the rejections, both big and small, that came not because of her abilities, but because of how people saw her. When she applied for an internship at a major tech company during college, the interviewer had smiled and said, "We're looking for someone with a more refined background." When she tried to rent her first office space after graduating, the landlord told her the space had just been leased, despite the for rent signs still hanging in the window. And when she walked into boardrooms filled with men in suits, they would nod politely but dismissively, barely bothering to listen to her ideas. But Nina had a secret weapon that none of them could take away: her resolve. Every time she was rejected, every time she was told she wasn't good enough or didn't belong, it only fueled her desire to succeed. She studied harder, worked longer hours, and fought for every opportunity with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. She graduated top of her class with a degree in computer engineering, interned at a small startup, where she learned the ins and outs of business, and eventually, with nothing but a small loan and a big idea, started her own tech company. The early days of building her business had been brutal. There were nights when Nina barely slept, fueled by nothing but caffeine and sheer determination. Investors were hard to come by, and many of them, just like Christopher at the Wellington, didn't see her for who she was. They saw her skin, her gender, her background, and dismissed her. Some meetings ended before they even started. Others were polite, but the investors would say things like, "It's a risky idea," or "We're not sure the market's ready for this." But Nina knew better. She had spent her life navigating risk. She had grown up in a world where the odds were always stacked against her, and she had learned how to play the game. Her company, Anderson Tech, started small, but within a few years, it became known for its innovative products and cutting-edge solutions. It wasn't long before the investors who had once turned her away were knocking on her door, begging for a chance to be a part of her success. By the time Nina hit her early 30s, she had built a multi-million-dollar empire. She had become one of the most successful black women in the tech industry, gracing the covers of business magazines and giving keynote speeches at major conferences. But no matter how much success she achieved, no matter how many accolades she received, there was always that undercurrent of prejudice lurking beneath the surface. People who couldn't quite wrap their heads around the fact that a woman like her, black, female, from a working-class background, could be where she was. It was as though they believed she had broken some unspoken rule, that she had somehow cheated the system just by succeeding. She had faced countless Christophers in her lifetime, people who looked at her and saw nothing more than their own assumptions. But something about this particular encounter, about being turned away from a hotel where she had reserved the penthouse suite, brought back all those years of silent struggles, the constant need to prove herself over and over again. Nina wasn't angry because she had been turned away from a hotel. She was angry because she had been reduced to something less than she was. And despite her success, despite her achievements, the world still had a way of reminding her that she didn't truly belong in places like the Wellington. But this time, things were different. This time, she wasn't just some college kid trying to get an internship, or a young entrepreneur scraping together enough to start a company. She was Nina Anderson, CEO, tech mogul, billionaire. And she had the power to do more than just prove them wrong. As the car pulled up to her office building, a towering structure of glass and steel, Nina stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She walked through the lobby, greeted by the familiar faces of her employees, who looked at her with respect and admiration. They knew who she was, they knew what she had built, and most importantly, they knew her story, the real story, not the one that people like Christopher assumed when they saw her. Nina made her way to her office, a spacious corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. She dropped her purse on the desk and sat down, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the keyboard as she opened her laptop. The email she had drafted earlier to her legal team was still open on the screen, waiting for her to hit send. The Wellington Hotel didn't know it yet, but they had just entered into a deal that would change everything. Nina had been watching the hotel for months, aware of its financial struggles, aware that it was up for sale. She had originally considered passing on the opportunity. Her business was in tech, after all, not hospitality. But now, after her experience with Christopher and his condescending smile, Nina had made up her mind. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making a point. And if there was one thing Nina Anderson was good at, it was making points loud and clear. With a quick motion, she hit send. The deal was in motion, and soon enough, the Wellington Hotel would be hers. Not because she needed it, not because she wanted to make anyone suffer, but because she had spent her whole life overcoming people like Christopher, people who didn't see her, people who underestimated her. And now, she was in a position to make sure no one else ever had to face that same kind of prejudice in her hotel. Nina leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. 6 months had passed since Nina Anderson's last encounter with the Wellington Hotel, and the memory of that humiliating night hadn't dulled. If anything, it had fueled her even more. She had never been the kind of person to take injustice lying down, and that night, being turned away so easily, had ignited something within her. But now, she wasn't just seeking retribution. She was making a statement. Behind the scenes, she had quietly orchestrated one of her most strategic acquisitions to date. It wasn't a business deal driven by profits or innovation like her usual ventures. This one was personal. She hadn't planned to enter the hotel industry, but when the opportunity to purchase the Wellington had crossed her path, it felt like karma's hand was pushing her in that direction. And now, the papers were signed, the contracts finalized, and the Wellington Hotel was officially hers. As she sat in the back of her black SUV, watching the towering building come into view, Nina couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. The weather was different this time. No rain, just a crisp, clear afternoon with the sun reflecting off the hotel's glossy windows. Everything about this visit was different. She wasn't stepping into the Wellington as a weary traveler seeking rest. This time, she was returning as its owner. The sleek vehicle came to a smooth stop at the entrance, and one of the hotel's doormen, oblivious to the significance of her arrival, rushed forward to open the door for her. Nina stepped out, adjusting her fitted navy blazer and smoothing down her pants. Her polished black heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the grand entrance, head held high. Inside, the hotel lobby was just as opulent as she remembered. The same sparkling chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors. The air was filled with the soft murmur of well-to-do guests, the clinking of glasses from the nearby bar, and the distant hum of luxury that defined the Wellington. But this time, Nina wasn't here to marvel at the atmosphere or get lost in the grandeur. She was here to make her presence known. As she crossed the threshold into the lobby, she immediately caught sight of Christopher, the very same receptionist who had dismissed her all those months ago. He stood behind the front desk, his back straight and his expression serious as he dealt with a guest. His meticulously styled hair and sharp uniform gave him the air of professionalism. But Nina remembered the cold indifference in his eyes when he had told her there were no rooms available. She remembered how he hadn't even bothered to check her reservation properly before brushing her aside. Christopher didn't recognize her immediately. She had been just another guest to him that night, and he had likely dismissed countless others in the same way. But today, she wasn't just another guest. She was his new boss. Nina walked directly toward the front desk, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm. As she approached, Christopher glanced up from the computer screen, his eyes narrowing slightly in recognition, though he couldn't place her right away. There was a flicker of confusion on his face as he tried to recall where he had seen her before. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted her with a practiced smile. "Welcome to the Wellington. How can I assist you today?" Nina smiled back, but there was no warmth in her eyes. "I'm here to meet the owner," she said, her voice steady and calm. Christopher's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment he hesitated. "The owner?" he repeated, his confusion deepening. "I'm not sure if—" Before he could finish his sentence, the hotel manager, Mr. Mitchell, appeared from the back office, his face lighting up when he saw Nina standing at the front desk. Unlike Christopher, Mitchell knew exactly who she was. The deal to acquire the Wellington had been finalized just a few days earlier, and he had been fully briefed on the new owner's background. "Ms. Anderson," Mitchell said, his voice overly enthusiastic as he approached with his hand extended. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. We're all very excited to have you here." Nina shook his hand, her grip firm and businesslike. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'm looking forward to seeing how things run here." Christopher, still standing behind the desk, looked between Nina and Mitchell with dawning realization. His face paled as the pieces began to fall into place. This was the woman he had turned away, the woman he hadn't thought twice about, the guest he had dismissed as if she were nothing. And now, she owned the hotel. The shock and horror on his face would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Nina watched as his composure cracked, the professional facade he wore so well slipping away as his mind raced to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say. Mitchell, unaware of the tension between the two, gestured toward the elevators. "Shall we head up to my office? We can go over some of the details of the transition." Nina nodded, but before she followed him, she turned to Christopher, locking eyes with him for the first time since her arrival. "Christopher, isn't it?" she said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, ma'am. I remember you from my last visit here," Nina continued, her gaze never wavering. "You were the one who told me there were no rooms available, even though I had a confirmed reservation." Christopher's face flushed a deep red. He opened his mouth again, struggling to find anything, to say in his defense. "I am so sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize who I was," Nina finished for him, her voice dangerously soft. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't think I was important enough to check." The lobby seemed to grow quieter around them as the weight of her words settled over Christopher like a crushing burden. He looked utterly defeated, and for a moment, Nina felt a flicker of satisfaction. But she wasn't here for revenge. She was here to change things, to ensure that no one else ever experienced the kind of treatment she had. Without waiting for his response, Nina turned away and followed Mitchell toward the elevators. Christopher stood frozen at the desk, his heart pounding in his chest. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he was paying for it. As the elevator doors closed behind Nina and Mitchell, the hotel manager cleared his throat, awkwardly. "I'm terribly sorry if any of our staff were rude to you during your previous visit," he said, trying to smooth things over. "We take customer service very seriously, and I can assure you that we'll be making improvements under your leadership." Nina gave a small nod, her mind already shifting to the bigger picture. She wasn't here to micromanage the staff's mistakes. She was here to reshape the entire culture of the hotel. "We'll discuss all of that in time, Mr. Mitchell," she said calmly. "For now, I'd like to focus on the broader vision for the Wellington." When they arrived at the executive suite, Nina was greeted with the kind of luxury that only old money could buy. The walls were lined with mahogany, the furniture plush and elegant. It was the perfect representation of the kind of exclusivity the Wellington was known for. Exclusivity that had also bred a toxic sense of entitlement among the staff. As she sat across from Mitchell at the grand oak desk, she began to outline her vision for the hotel. She didn't want to turn it into a completely different establishment. Its legacy was part of its charm, but there were things that needed to change. And Nina knew exactly where to start. "We're going to make the Wellington a place where every guest feels welcome," she said, her voice firm. "No matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from, I won't tolerate any form of discrimination in this hotel, whether it's explicit or hidden behind a smile." Mitchell nodded quickly, eager to show his agreement. "Absolutely, Miss Anderson. I couldn't agree more." Nina leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. "Good. Because the changes I'm going to implement won't be easy for everyone to accept. Some people might resist, especially those who are used to the way things have always been. But we're not here to maintain the status quo. We're here to create something better." The weeks following Nina Anderson's takeover of the Wellington Hotel were a whirlwind of change, tension, and for many of the staff, fear. From the moment she stepped into ownership, everyone knew the hotel was no longer the same place. The luxurious veneer of exclusivity that had once shrouded the Wellington had now been punctured by Nina's determined push for inclusivity, fairness, and respect. Nina's changes started small but were deeply symbolic. The first thing to go was the unspoken culture of favoritism and racial profiling that had permeated the staff's interactions with guests. New training sessions were rolled out immediately, focusing on unconscious bias, empathy, and customer service. This wasn't just about being polite anymore. It was about understanding that every guest, regardless of their background, was to be treated with the same level of respect and dignity. But it wasn't long before Nina's changes grew bolder. She brought in outside consultants, experts in diversity and inclusivity, to help the staff at every level learn how to break old habits and embrace the new direction of the hotel. Employees who had grown comfortable with the old ways, who had always known that certain guests received better service than others, were suddenly being held accountable. No more turning a blind eye to the silent, insidious discrimination that had gone on for too long. Christopher, the receptionist who had dismissed Nina on her first visit, was one of the first to feel the pressure. After that humiliating encounter when she had returned as the owner, he had been walking on eggshells, terrified of what might come next. He had tried to bury himself in work, hoping to redeem himself by being the best employee he could be, but the atmosphere had changed. The friendly smiles and camaraderie among the staff were gone. Everyone was focused, on edge, knowing that one slip-up could cost them their jobs. Christopher had apologized profusely to Nina during a staff meeting one afternoon, in front of everyone, his face flushed with shame. But she had simply listened, acknowledged his apology with a brief nod, and moved on. There was no grand forgiveness, no dramatic moment of reconciliation, just a cold, professional acknowledgement that left him feeling more unsettled than if she had reprimanded him. The lesson, however, was clear. Things at the Wellington would never be the same again. In the weeks that followed, Christopher found himself constantly reflecting on that moment and on the many others like it that he had been a part of over the years. He had never seen himself as a racist or prejudiced person. But now, as he thought back on all the times he had turned away guests based on their appearance, or assumed the worst about someone simply because they didn't fit the image of what he thought a Wellington guest should be, he realized just how complicit he had been. It wasn't just him, of course. It was the entire system, an unspoken hierarchy that placed wealthy, predominantly white guests at the top and everyone else at the bottom. But now, under Nina's leadership, that hierarchy was being dismantled piece by piece. The changes didn't stop with the staff. Nina began making over the hotel's guest policies as well. She introduced a new loyalty program aimed at making the Wellington more accessible to a diverse range of clientele. The hotel started partnering with local organizations to offer discounted rates to community leaders, artists, and educators, people who brought more to the world than just wealth. It was a bold move, one that initially raised eyebrows among the old guard of regular guests who were used to the hotel catering exclusively to the upper crust. Some of these guests, those who had frequented the Wellington for years, were less than thrilled with the changes. A few even made snide remarks about the new direction of the hotel, muttering to staff or complaining to management that the Wellington was losing its prestige. But Nina didn't flinch. One evening, an elderly couple who had been loyal patrons for decades approached Nina as she was walking through the lobby. Mr. Harrington, a well-known figure in the local business community, had always considered himself a friend of the Wellington. He was used to being greeted by name when he arrived, his bags whisked away before he even reached the front desk, and his favorite table reserved at the hotel's restaurant, no matter how busy they were. As he stopped Nina, there was a hint of indignation in his voice. "I must say, Miss Anderson," Mr. Harrington began, his tone condescending, "the Wellington is changing quite a bit since you've taken over. We've been coming here for over 30 years, and I'm not sure we agree with all of these new policies." Nina raised an eyebrow, sensing the veiled criticism beneath his polite words. "I appreciate your loyalty to the hotel, Mr. Harrington. Change can be difficult, especially when you've been accustomed to a certain way of doing things." His wife, standing beside him, gave Nina a tight-lipped smile, but it was clear she shared her husband's sentiment. "It's just that. We've always loved the exclusivity of the Wellington. It's what made it special, don't you think?" Nina smiled, but her eyes were sharp. "Exclusivity can be dangerous when it starts to mean exclusion," she replied. "We're not taking away the luxury that you love about the Wellington. We're simply broadening who gets to experience it." Mr. Harrington stiffened, clearly displeased with her response. "Well, I hope you don't lose too many of your regular guests in the process," he said, his voice clipped. Nina's smile didn't waver. "I'm confident we're attracting the right kind of guests, people who value respect, diversity, and inclusivity as much as they value luxury. The Wellington is evolving, Mr. Harrington, and I'm proud of the direction we're heading." Without giving him a chance to argue further, Nina politely excused herself and continued on her way, leaving the couple standing in the lobby, their discontented whispers fading into the background. For every Mr. Harrington who grumbled about the changes, there were new guests arriving at the Wellington, people who had never felt welcome there before, but now found themselves drawn to the hotel's new ethos. Nina's efforts were already paying off. Word spread quickly in the city that the Wellington was undergoing a transformation, and soon the hotel was attracting a more diverse clientele, from young professionals to artists and entrepreneurs who had previously stayed away because they felt the place was too stuffy or unwelcoming. The hotel's revenue, surprisingly to some of the more conservative board members, didn't suffer. In fact, it grew. The new wave of guests brought fresh energy and ideas, and the Wellington became known not just as a place of luxury, but as a place where everyone was treated with dignity. But not everyone adapted to the changes. A few of the older staff members, those who had been at the hotel for decades and were deeply entrenched in the old ways of doing things, quietly left. Some resigned, others retired early, unwilling or unable to embrace the new culture. Nina didn't force them to stay. She understood that not everyone would be comfortable with the shift, but she wasn't about to let their discomfort stand in the way of progress. Christopher, however, stayed. He could have easily left, his pride bruised and his confidence shattered after his initial encounter with Nina, but instead he chose to learn. He attended every training session, listened carefully to the diversity and inclusion workshops, and even sought out advice from the consultants Nina had brought in. He had made a mistake, a big one, but he wasn't about to let it define his career. One afternoon, as Nina was passing through the lobby on her way to a meeting, she noticed Christopher behind the front desk. He was greeting a young family, a black couple with 2 small children, and this time his smile was genuine, his tone warm and welcoming. Nina paused for a moment, watching him from a distance. She could see the change in him, the way he interacted with guests now, with no trace of the cold indifference he had shown her on that fateful night months ago. Christopher caught sight of her watching him, and for a brief second their eyes met. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the growth he had undergone. Nina nodded back, a small smile playing on her lips as she continued on her way. The Wellington Hotel had changed, and so had Christopher. Months had passed since Nina Anderson took ownership of the Wellington Hotel, and the transformation was undeniable. What had once been an establishment steeped in old-world exclusivity and quiet discrimination had evolved into a place of luxury where diversity and respect reigned. Nina's vision for the hotel had been realized, and the Wellington was no longer just a destination for the wealthy elite. It had become a symbol of progress, inclusivity, and elegance. The changes hadn't been easy for everyone, but they had been necessary. Nina knew that the road to meaningful change was often fraught with resistance, but as the weeks rolled on, the Wellington began to thrive in ways it never had before. Guest reviews praised the hotel for its newfound warmth, its inclusive atmosphere, and its exceptional service. The diversity of the guests had increased dramatically, and the hotel was seeing more business than ever. But this transformation wasn't just about the numbers. For Nina, it was about something far more important: setting a precedent. The Wellington was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It was now a beacon of equality and fairness. And in a world that still carried the scars of prejudice and discrimination, this shift was more than just a business decision. It was a moral imperative. As Nina walked through the hotel one crisp autumn afternoon, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The grand lobby, with its sparkling chandeliers and polished marble floors, was bustling with activity. Families, business people, artists, and travelers from all walks of life mingled together, their conversations filling the air with a vibrant energy that the hotel had lacked before. Nina paused by the large windows that overlooked the city skyline, taking a moment to appreciate just how far she and the hotel had come. She thought back to that first night, months ago, when she had been turned away at the front desk, dismissed as though she didn't belong. The sting of that memory had faded, but it had left a permanent mark on her. It had been the catalyst for everything that had followed. She hadn't set out to punish anyone. In fact, revenge had never been her goal. Nina had learned long ago that vengeance only left people empty, no matter how justified it might feel in the moment. Instead, she had focused on what really mattered: creating change. And in doing so, she had turned the Wellington into a place where no one would ever be judged based on their appearance, background, or race. But there was one person whose growth over the past months had surprised her more than anyone else. Christopher, the very receptionist who had turned her away that night. Nina hadn't expected much from him after that initial confrontation. In fact, she had assumed he would either leave or continue to operate under the same prejudices he'd held before. But Christopher had proven her wrong. He hadn't just apologized. He had made a genuine effort to change, to learn from his mistakes, and to become a better person. In the weeks following her takeover, Christopher had gone through a profound transformation. He had participated in every training session, asked questions during workshops, and even sought feedback from colleagues on how he could improve his interactions with guests. Slowly but surely, the icy, indifferent demeanor he had once carried melted away, replaced by a man who was thoughtful, empathetic, and eager to do his job right. One afternoon, as Nina made her way through the lobby, she noticed Christopher at the front desk, talking to an elderly woman who seemed flustered and lost. He was patient, speaking to her in a calm, reassuring tone, helping her find her way to her room. It was a far cry from the dismissive attitude he had shown Nina during her first visit, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. Later that day, Nina called Christopher into her office. He walked in, nervous as ever, his posture slightly stiff. Despite his efforts to change, he still carried the weight of that first interaction with Nina, knowing it had left a lasting impression. He had been working harder than ever, hoping to prove that he was more than the person who had once turned her away. "You wanted to see me, Ms. Anderson?" he asked, his voice respectful but apprehensive. Nina leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment before speaking. "Yes, Christopher, I wanted to talk to you about something." He nodded, waiting. "I've been watching you these past few months," Nina began, her voice calm but firm. "You've made some remarkable changes." Christopher's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes still held a trace of anxiety. "Thank you, ma'am. I've been trying to." "You don't need to explain," Nina interrupted gently. "Your actions speak for themselves. I know that what happened when I first came here was uncomfortable for both of us, but I also believe in second chances. I believe that people can grow, and you've proven that." He blinked, clearly surprised by her words. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to have stayed and improved. I know I made mistakes, and I'll keep working to make sure nothing like that ever happens again." Nina gave him a small smile. "It won't, because you're no longer the person you were that night. You've taken this as a chance to learn and to become better, and that's all I could ask for. But I also want you to understand that this isn't just about your growth. It's about creating an environment where everyone, staff and guests alike, feels valued and respected. You've become part of that." Christopher nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. For months, he had been haunted by the shame of how he had treated her, and now hearing these words from her was a relief he hadn't expected. "There's one more thing," Nina said, her tone shifting slightly. "I'm offering you a promotion." He stared at her, stunned. "A promotion?" "Yes," Nina said, her smile widening. "You've earned it. You've shown dedication, responsibility, and a willingness to change. I want you to be part of the leadership team here at the Wellington. You'll help me continue to build this hotel into the kind of place it's meant to be." For a moment, Christopher was speechless. The weight of the offer, the significance of what it meant, hit him like a wave. After everything he had done, after all the mistakes he had made, Nina was offering him a second chance, not just as an employee, but as a leader. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." Nina stood up, extending her hand to him. "You don't need to say anything, Christopher. Just keep doing what you've been doing." He shook her hand, a flood of emotions coursing through him. Relief, gratitude, and something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. For the first time, he was proud of the person he had become. As Christopher left her office, Nina felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what real change looked like. It wasn't about tearing people down or holding grudges. It was about giving people the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become better. The hotel was thriving, but more importantly, the people who worked there were thriving. Nina had achieved more than just financial success with the Wellington. She had created a culture that reflected the values she had spent her life fighting for. Karma, Nina realized, wasn't about delivering punishment or seeking revenge. It was about balance. It was about creating opportunities for people to rise above their mistakes, to learn from them, and to move forward with kindness, empathy, and respect. And in the end, that was the real victory. As she walked through the hotel lobby one last time that evening, watching the guests and staff interact with warmth and genuine care, Nina smiled to herself. The Wellington had come full circle. It wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when people were given the chance to rise above their pasts and build something better. The lesson had been learned, the changes had been made, and the karma Nina had set in motion had come back. Not in retribution, but in kindness. And that, she knew, was how real change happened. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.